She hit the frozen ground before anyone could catch her. Not from weakness, not from cold, but because her knees finally gave out after 11 doors had shut in her face that same afternoon, and the 12th had slammed so hard the sound cracked across the snow like a rifle shot. Abigail Turner pressed one hand flat against the ice and forced herself back up. She would not stay down. Not today. Not ever. But God help her, she did not know how much longer she could keep standing. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The wind had teeth that afternoon. It came off the high ridgeline above Red Hollow with a fury that had no patience for the living, cutting straight through wool and cotton and flesh as though none of it existed, as though a body was just one more thing the Wyoming winter intended to grind down to nothing before spring ever bothered to show its face again. The sky above had gone the color of a bruise, that deep, ugly purple gray, that old ranchers recognized on sight and didn't need a second look at to know what was coming. Another storm. A mean one. The kind that didn't announce itself with courtesy. Abigail Turner felt it in her fingers first. She had been walking since before dawn, and her boots worn through at the left heel, the right sole separating from the upper. In a gap she'd stuffed with a folded piece of newspaper 3 days ago, had stopped keeping out the cold somewhere around mid-morning. Her suitcase was not heavy. There was almost nothing left in it. A spare dress. A hairbrush with half its bristles missing. A small tin of dried beans she hadn't been able to bring herself to eat because she didn't know how many more days she'd have to make them last. A notebook, old and water-stained at the corners, that she carried everywhere and never let anyone see. That was the sum of Abigail Turner at 30 years old. She had not always been this way. There had been a time, distant now, soft at the edges, the way old memories get when you've spent too long trying not to think about them, when she had believed that hard work was its own protection. That if you kept your head down, and your hands busy, and your mouth respectful, the world would treat you fair. She had believed that with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had no other option but to believe it, because the alternative was to stop moving, and she had never been able to afford to stop moving. The East had cured her of that particular faith slowly, the way a long illness works. Not all at once, but in increments. Each small humiliation, adding to the last, until the accumulated weight of it became simply the shape of her life. She had lost her final boarding job in Philadelphia 2 months ago. The woman of the house, a thin-lipped widow with a voice like a letter opener, had called her into the parlor on a Tuesday morning and told her without once meeting her eyes that her services were no longer required. She had given no reason. She had not needed to. Abigail had seen it in the way the woman looked at her the first day she arrived, that quick inventory, that slight adjustment of expression, and she had known then that the job would not last. The same way she always knew, the same way a person learns to read weather when they've been caught in enough storms. She had taken her wages 3 weeks short of what she was owed, and she had not argued. She had bought a train ticket west instead. West was where a person went when the East had finished with them. West was where the stories said a body could start over, could make something from nothing, could be judged by their labor rather than their lineage or their face, or the particular way God had chosen to arrange their bones. West was the promise that America kept making to the people it had already broken, and Abigail Turner, despite everything, was still the kind of woman who listened to promises. Red Hollow, Wyoming territory had not received her kindly. She had arrived on a Wednesday, stepped off the stage with her suitcase and her newspaper-stuffed boot and her careful expression, and within 48 hours she had understood precisely what kind of welcome waited for a woman like her in a town like this. She had gone to the hotel first, asked about housekeeping work, and watched the proprietor's wife look her over. The way a person examines spoiled goods at a market stall, with that particular combination of distaste and disinterest that required no words, because the message was already fully legible in every line of the woman's face. "We don't have anything," the woman had said. "I'm a hard worker, ma'am. I don't require much by way of—" I said we don't have anything. She had tried the diner, the livery stable, the church where she had spoken to the minister's wife, and been told very gently, very kindly, in the particular tone that charitable people used when they wanted to say no without having to witness the consequences of their refusal, that there simply wasn't anything available just now, but she should absolutely come back in the spring. She had tried 4 separate ranch properties along the road leading north out of town, and at 3 of them she had not even gotten as far as the front door before someone had waved her off from the porch. At the 4th, a man had looked at her for a long moment from behind his fence post, and then said loud enough for the 2 hands working nearby to hear, "I got enough problems without adding to them." One of the hands had laughed. Abigail had turned and walked back to the road. She had not cried. She was past crying. Crying required a kind of energy she no longer had to spare, and it required the belief that someone might see the tears and be moved by them, and she had lost that particular belief some years before Philadelphia. What she had instead was forward motion, the simple mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other, which required nothing from the world, except that the ground remained solid beneath her. The ground, at least, had not yet failed her. It was past 3 in the afternoon when she turned onto the road that led to the Walker property, and she almost didn't take it. She had already been turned away 11 times since morning. 11 times she had straightened her spine and arranged her face into something that she hoped read as capable and steady and worth the risk of a yes, and 11 times some version of that same expression. The inventory, the adjustment, the deliberate blankness had looked back at her from the other side of a door or a fence or a porch rail. 11 times she had walked away with nothing but the cold and the lengthening shadow of afternoon and the growing awareness that she was running out of road. The Walker property looked like it was running out of road too. She could see that even before she reached the gate, the fence along the western line had sections that wanted mending. The barn, visible at a distance, had a section of roof where the boards had gone dark with weather damage. The yard between the gate and the house was empty of the kind of purposeful activity that marked a ranch in good health. No hands moving between buildings. No organized activity. Just a stillness that felt less like peace than exhaustion. But there was smoke coming from the chimney, and there was a lamp lit in the front window, even though it wasn't yet dark enough to need one, which told her that whoever was inside was burning fuel because the cold had already gotten into the house, and they needed the light more than they needed to save the oil. She knew that calculation. She had made it herself too many times. She pushed open the gate. The porch steps creaked under her weight, 2 of them old wood, the kind that announces arrivals, whether or not announcements were wanted, and she stood at the door for a moment with her suitcase in one hand, and the cold in both lungs, and the knowledge that this was the last house on this road. And after this, there was nothing but open country and nightfall and temperatures that would not negotiate. She knocked. She heard movement inside. The particular shuffle and thump of a household in motion, the low murmur of voices, the sound of something being set down on a wooden surface. Then, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who was tired, but still moving because stopping wasn't an option. The door opened. The man who stood in the doorway was somewhere in his mid-30s, though he looked older in the way that hard years age a person past their calendar count. He was broad through the shoulders with the kind of hands that had been working since before they were fully grown, and his face carried the particular expression of someone who had been managing too many problems for too long, and had arrived at a place beyond irritation into something quieter and more final. His jaw was shadowed with several days of unshaved growth. His eyes, dark, careful set deep beneath a brow that held its tension even at rest, moved over her once quickly with the same practiced efficiency she had come to recognize as the universal language of assessment. She was used to what came next, but she spoke before he could. "Please." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, and she was grateful for it. "Please, sir, I'm not asking for wages. I'm not asking for much of anything. Just a roof, somewhere out of the cold. I'll work from first light to last. I'll do anything that needs doing. I'll sleep in the barn if that's all there is. I won't ask for more than what's fair. I won't cause trouble. I just—" She stopped, drew one careful breath. "I just need somewhere to be tonight that isn't out there." Caleb Walker said nothing. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the blank dismissal she'd seen all day, Not the faint contemptuous amusement of the man by the fence post. Not the practiced kindness of the minister's wife. Something else. Something that held still long enough to actually look at her instead of through her or past her. "You got a name," he said. "Abigail Turner." "Where are you coming from, Miss Turner?" "East," she said. "Philadelphia most recently, before that various places." "You got references?" "No, sir." She held his gaze. "The woman I last worked for didn't offer to provide them, and I didn't think it would improve her mood to ask." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement. Something adjacent to it, quieter and less certain of itself. "You been to other places today?" he said. "Yes." "How many?" 11. He absorbed that. His jaw tightened slightly and then released. He looked past her for a moment at the road, at the sky, at the color of the clouds massing above the ridge. And then he looked back at her with an expression that had come to some kind of decision she hadn't been a party to, and wasn't entirely sure she would have voted for, if given the chance. "Come inside," he said. She followed him in. The house was cold. Not desperately so. The fire in the main room was doing its work, but cold in the bone-deep way that suggested it had been fighting a losing battle against the walls for some time. The main room held a table, 6 chairs, a cook stove that had seen better years, and 4 children arranged at various points around the space, in the arrested posture of people who had stopped what they were doing when they heard the knock at the door and had not yet decided to resume. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 14, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, standing near the cook stove with her arms folded and her expression making no effort at courtesy. The second was a boy, around 11, leaning against the wall by the window with the posture of someone trying to appear casual about the fact that he was watching everything very carefully. The third was a girl of about 8 who had a doll pressed to her chest and was looking at Abigail with large eyes that had not yet learned to hide what they felt. And the youngest, a boy of perhaps 5, was standing behind his older brother and peering around his arm with the pure, frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet been taught to perform indifference. Abigail looked at them. She had been in enough houses to know within minutes of walking through a door the true condition of the people living behind it. Not what they chose to show the outside world, not the arranged furniture and the swept porch and the Sunday best expressions, but the actual state of things which announced itself in smaller ways, in the specific quality of the silence and the particular tension in the way bodies held themselves, and the look of the food on the table, and the condition of the clothing, and the eyes of the children, especially the children who had not yet learned to mask the particular anxiety of a household that was not certain it would be all right. She saw it here clearly. She said nothing about it. "This is Emily," Caleb said, indicating the oldest girl, who gave Abigail a look that was not unfriendly so much as deeply evaluating. "Jacob, Lucy, and that's Ben behind his brother." "Hello," Abigail said to all of them, and meant it simply without performance. "I can offer you the room at the back," Caleb said. "It's not warm. I won't pretend otherwise. There's a cot and a blanket, and that's the sum of it. In exchange, I need help with the house and whatever else comes up. I can't pay wages. Food and shelter is what I've got." "That's more than I had an hour ago," Abigail said. "I accept." Emily made a small sound, not quite a word, and turned back to the stove. Jacob went back to looking at the window. Lucy continued to look at Abigail with those large, too perceptive eyes. Ben from behind his brother's arm said, "Are you going to stay?" "Ben," Caleb said. "I don't know yet," Abigail said honestly, and Ben considered this, and apparently found it a satisfactory answer because he came out from behind his brother and went back to whatever he had been doing before the knock at the door. Caleb showed her the room. It was exactly as described: a cot, a blanket, a small window that let in a draft along its lower edge that she would need to address with something, a hook on the wall for her coat, and nothing else. The cold in that room was specific and serious. The kind of cold that settled in and stayed. The kind that would be in her bones by morning. She set her suitcase down on the cot and opened it and took out the spare dress and hung it on the hook and looked at the small tin of beans for a moment, and then closed the case. "Dinner's in an hour," Caleb said from the doorway. "I'll help," she said. "You don't have to tonight." "I know." She turned to face him. "But I'd like to see what you've got to work with." He studied her for a moment with that same unreadable expression. Then he stepped back from the doorway and let her follow him to the kitchen. What she found in that kitchen, in the pantry, in the cellar, in the storage corner behind the door, told her everything she needed to know, and none of it was good. The supplies were not organized. They were not measured. The inventory, such as it was, existed in no written form that she could find, which meant that no one in this house knew with any precision how much food they actually had, or how long it would last, or where the gaps were. She could see already the shape of what was coming. Not immediately. Not this week. But before spring. Before the snow let up and the roads reopened and the supply wagons started moving again. She said nothing. She helped Emily finish the dinner, a thin stew that she quietly extended with the dried beans from her own tin, crumbling them in while the girl wasn't watching, saying nothing about it. And she sat at the far end of the table and took the smallest portion and watched the children eat and said little and listened to everything. Caleb watched her watching them. He didn't say anything either. After dinner, while the children were occupied, he came and stood near the kitchen doorway, where she was cleaning the cookware, and said without preamble, "Why'd you really come west?" She kept her hands moving. "Already told you. You told me what happened. I'm asking why you came west instead of somewhere else." She thought about that for a moment. "Because west is where you go when you've already tried everywhere else and found it wanting." "And have you tried everywhere else?" "Enough of everywhere else," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The room's going to be cold tonight. I know. I can get you another blanket." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He brought it without ceremony and hung it over the back of the cot, and that was the end of that conversation. And Abigail sat in the cold room that night and opened her notebook, the old water-stained one she never let anyone see, and wrote down everything she had observed about the pantry and the cellar and the storage corner, and the state of the firewood stack she'd seen at the side of the house, and the quality of the livestock, sounds she'd heard from the direction of the barn. She wrote it all down in small, careful columns with the stub of a pencil she kept in the notebook's spine. Numbers, quantities, rates of consumption against estimated remaining supply. The numbers, when she added them, told a story she had seen before. Told it clearly and without sentiment, the way numbers always did. This family would not make it to spring on what they currently had. Not unless something changed. Abigail sat with that knowledge for a long time in the cold room, with the wind working at the window, and the lamp turned low to save the oil. And she thought about the 11 doors that had shut in her face today. And she thought about Philadelphia, and she thought about the particular shape that survival had taken across the various chapters of her life, and she thought about the boy who had peered at her from behind his brother's arm, and asked with the complete directness of a 5-year-old, who did not yet understand why adults made simple things complicated, whether she was going to stay. Then she turned to a fresh page in the notebook and began to plan, not for herself, for them, because she had walked through enough cold and enough closed doors to know the difference between a family that was struggling and a family that was going to lose, and she had sat at enough tables where the portions were too small and the silences were too careful, and the children's eyes held that particular quality of low-grade worry that children shouldn't have to carry, and she could not walk away from that. She had never been able to walk away from that. It was not something she could explain exactly. It was not something she had ever tried to explain to anyone, because no one had ever asked her in a way that made the question feel like it wanted a real answer. But it was the most fundamental truth about Abigail Turner. She could survive being dismissed, being overlooked, being turned away, being laughed at, being assessed and found wanting by every standard the world chose to apply to her. She had been doing that her whole life. She knew exactly how to survive that. What she could not survive, what she had never been able to make herself walk away from, was watching someone else go under when she could see the water rising and knew where the rope was. She wrote until the lamp began to gutter. Then she blew it out and lay down on the cot in the dark and listened to the wind say its piece about what winter intended, and she made her plans in the silence, careful and exact, and entirely without announcement. Outside, the snow began to fall. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight by the time Abigail found the first real problem. Not the cold, not the thin walls, or the drafty window, or the cot that creaked every time she shifted her weight in the night. Those were problems she had already cataloged and assigned to the category of things that could be endured. The real problem announced itself on the fourth morning when she went down to the food cellar before anyone else was awake, and held her lamp up and looked at what was actually there. Not what she had estimated from her first quick survey, but what was genuinely, measurably, mathematically present on those shelves, and felt a cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. She stood there for a long moment with the lamp in one hand and her notebook in the other, moving down the shelves, slowly counting, recording, calculating in the small, precise columns she had developed over years of making too little stretch too far. She counted the jars of preserved vegetables. She noted the grade and quantity of the smoked meat hanging at the far end. She lifted lids and checked grain levels, and ran her fingers along the lower shelves where moisture had gotten in at some point, and left a water line that told her the cellar had flooded at least once in the past year, which meant anything stored at floor level had to be considered compromised, regardless of how it appeared on the surface. When she was done, she stood very still and looked at her numbers. Then she looked at them again, because the first time through she had made an arithmetic error, or at least she had hoped she had, but the second time produced the same result as the first. At the current rate of household consumption, the Walker family would exhaust their food supply by the third week of February. It was not yet December. She closed her notebook, climbed back up the cellar steps, and set about making breakfast with the particular quality of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to not let fear drive. She did not say anything to Caleb that morning. She needed to understand more before she spoke. She needed to know whether the numbers she was seeing reflected the actual situation, or whether there were resources she hadn't yet located, a second cellar, a cache somewhere on the property, supplies stored elsewhere that hadn't been mentioned. She needed to know whether Caleb already understood the shape of what was coming, or whether he had been managing the problem the way exhausted people often manage things they cannot afford to look at directly by not looking directly. She served breakfast. She watched. Jacob ate quickly and with the focused efficiency of a boy who had learned not to leave food on his plate. Lucy ate more slowly, and Abigail noticed that she left a portion of her bread. Not because she didn't want it, because she did. Abigail could see that plainly, but because Ben had finished his and was looking at the table with the particular expression of a 5-year-old who understood that asking for more was not something that happened in this house. Lucy slid her remaining bread across to her brother without a word. Ben took it without a word. Emily saw the exchange and looked away. Caleb didn't see it. He was looking at his coffee. Real coffee, which Abigail had found less than a quarter pound of in the back of the pantry, and had used sparingly this morning, because she already understood that what was in that tin needed to last, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind his expression. After the children had gone about their morning, Abigail began asking questions. She asked them the way she asked everything practically without preamble, in the tone of someone gathering information rather than passing judgment. "The supply wagon," she said to Caleb, who was pulling on his coat near the back door. "When's the next one due?" He paused. "End of the month if the road holds." "And if it doesn't?" He looked at her. "Then it doesn't come until it does." "Has the road gone out before?" "3 winters out of 5, he said. "Last year it was closed for 6 weeks. She nodded. "What about the livestock feed situation?" Something shifted in his expression, a slight tightening, a quality of reluctance. "It'll do." "For how long?" "Long enough," he said, and the way he said it told her that he did not know the answer to that question and did not want to be in a conversation that required him to say so out loud. "I'm not asking to criticize," she said. "I'm asking because I need to understand what we're actually working with." He studied her for a moment. The reluctance was still there, but so was something else. Something that looked like the recognition of a person who had been managing a problem alone for long enough that the presence of someone else who wanted to understand it rather than be protected from it came as a particular kind of relief. "The feed'll last maybe 6 weeks," he said. 7 if I cut rations on the older animals. "And the food cellar. It's stocked well enough for winter." "Is it?" she said. He went still. "I went down this morning," she said, "before first light. I'm not trying to alarm you. I just need you to know what I found, because if I'm going to help this family get through to spring, I need us to be talking about the same situation." She told him the numbers. She told them plainly, without drama, in the same tone she would have used to read a ledger aloud, because that was what they were essentially, and treating them as anything other than data would not help either of them. She told him the quantities, the consumption rate, the estimated shortfall, the date by which, if nothing changed, the shelves would be bare. Caleb Walker stood very still through all of it. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment. "That can't be right," he said. And then more quietly, with the sound of a man who knows something is right and is saying otherwise because he needs one more second before he accepts it, "I thought we had more than that." The lower shelves took water at some point. Some of what looked like stored goods isn't usable. His jaw worked. He looked at the wall. He looked at his hands. "The children don't know," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "And they don't need to. Not yet. Maybe not at all if we handle this correctly." He looked at her, then really looked at her with the kind of attention that moves past the surface of a person and wants to understand what's underneath. "What does handling it correctly look like?" he said. "It looks like starting today," she said. "And it looks like you trusting me to do some things that might seem strange before they start making sense." Another long silence. Then, "All right," he said. And that was the agreement, simple and without ceremony, the way agreements in working households often were, not contracts, not promises, with speeches attached, just one person deciding that another person's word was worth something and acting accordingly. He went out to the barn. Abigail went to work. The first thing she did was take full inventory, not just of the cellar, but of every inch of that house. She went through the pantry shelf by shelf. She checked the storage corner behind the kitchen door. She looked in every tin and every sack and every jar. She noted what was there, what its condition was, how long it would keep, and what it could be stretched into. She noted what was not there that should have been, and began constructing in her mind the list of what needed to happen. Then she began reorganizing. Emily found her at it an hour later and stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, and her expression doing its level best to communicate that the presence of a near stranger rearranging her family's belongings was not something she had agreed to, and was not something she intended to simply accept without comment. "What are you doing?" Emily said. "Reorganizing the pantry," Abigail said. She did not stop working. "I can see that. Why?" "Because the way it's arranged right now makes it hard to know at a glance what you have and what you're running low on. If you can see it clearly, you can manage it better." "We've been managing it fine." Abigail placed a jar on the newly arranged shelf and turned to look at Emily directly. The girl was 14 and sharp and carrying something in her eyes that Abigail recognized, not anger exactly, but the particular vigilance of someone who has been the most responsible person in a room for longer than was fair, and has developed a protective skepticism toward anything that looks like it might try to take that responsibility away from her. Because if it takes the responsibility, it also takes the control, and control is the only thing that's been keeping the fear at bay. "You've been managing it beautifully," Abigail said, and she meant it. "Better than most adults I've known. But you've been managing it alone. You don't have to anymore." Emily's expression didn't soften, but it changed some barely perceptible shift, something beneath the surface. "My mother managed this kitchen," Emily said. "I know," Abigail said. She didn't know not the details of it, but she knew what the statement meant and what it was asking. "I'm not trying to replace anything," Abigail said. "I'm trying to help your family get through the winter. That's all I'm here to do." Emily looked at her for a long moment with those sharp measuring eyes. Then she unfolded her arms, walked to the other side of the pantry and said, "The grain sacks go on that side. Mama always kept them on that side." "Then that's where they'll go," Abigail said. They worked together without speaking much, and by the time they were done, the pantry looked different. Not transformed, not unrecognizable, but organized in a way that made the quantities visible, and the gaps obvious, and the overall situation legible to anyone who knew how to read a storeroom, which Abigail did, and which she was quietly beginning to teach Emily to do as well, without framing it as a lesson, simply by working alongside her and naming what she was doing and why. Jacob appeared at some point during the morning, watched for a while without comment, and then began bringing things from the storage corner without being asked. He didn't say much either, but he worked quickly and paid attention. That afternoon, Abigail made her first trip outside past the yard and along the property line toward the tree cover to the east. She wore her coat and her broken boots, and carried the canvas bag she'd found hanging on a hook near the back door. And she was back within the hour with the bag half full of things that didn't look to the untrained eye like food. Ben was waiting on the porch when she came back. "What's in the bag?" he said. "Supper," she said. He looked at the bag with deep skepticism. "That doesn't look like supper." "Not yet," she said. "Come inside and I'll show you what it turns into." He followed her to the kitchen with the pure, fascinated gravity of a 5-year-old who has been offered a demonstration of something potentially magical, and Abigail spread the contents of the bag on the kitchen table and began sorting through it. Dried rose hips, pine needles. The inner bark of a birch sapling she'd cut with the small knife she kept in her coat pocket. The woody stems of 2 plants she'd identified along the fence line, a handful of dried seed heads that had survived the first snowfall. "This is food," Ben said. "This is medicine and flavor and nutrition," she said. "Not all food looks like food until someone knows what to do with it." "Do you know what to do with it?" "I do," she said. He climbed up onto the chair beside the table and watched her work with the complete absorption of a child who has decided that whatever this is, it is the most interesting thing happening in the world right now. And Abigail worked and explained and let him ask questions and answered all of them because she understood intuitively what she was doing in that kitchen. In that moment was not just cooking, it was building something, laying down some kind of foundation. And the material she was laying it with was exactly this. The ordinary, unhurried, particular attention of one person to another. Emily came in partway through and stopped in the doorway. She watched Abigail show Ben how to separate the rosehip seeds from the flesh without being asked how to strip the inner bark into thin pieces that would steep properly. What the difference was between the seed heads that were safe and the ones that wanted leaving alone. She didn't say anything, but she moved into the kitchen and began doing her own work at the stove, and after a while she said without looking up, "Where did you learn all that?" "Hard winters," Abigail said. Emily absorbed this. "We've had hard winters." "I know," Abigail said. "That's why I'm here." The dinner that night was better than any of them expected. Not elaborate, nothing elaborate was possible, but fuller, warmer, more complete than the thin stew of the previous nights. Abigail had stretched the existing supplies with what she'd gathered, and with a technique of slow cooking that extracted more from less, and the result was something that filled the bowl and stayed with you, after which was the only thing that mattered. Jacob ate his portion, and then looked at the pot. Abigail served him another half portion before he could decide whether asking was appropriate. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them made anything of it. Caleb noticed. She could see him noticing the slight change in his expression, the quality of attention that moved from his own plate to the scene at the other end of the table registering something. But he didn't say anything at dinner, and neither did she. Later, when the children were in bed and the house had gone to that particular nighttime quiet that feels different from any other quiet, Caleb came to the kitchen where Abigail was reviewing her notebook and sat down across the table from her and said, "Where did you learn to cook like that?" "Like what?" she said. "Like making something out of nothing." She considered the question honestly. "I grew up with not much," she said. "And then I spent a long time working in houses where there also wasn't much, but for different reasons. You learn what you can do with what's there when there's no other option." He was quiet for a moment. Then, The children ate well tonight. They needed to. They always need to, he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it. Not self-pity, not accusation. Something more stripped than either of those, the particular rawness of a man who is trying very hard to do right by his children, and is aware in ways he cannot fully articulate of all the places where he is falling short. They will, Abigail said. Through the winter. I'm going to make sure of it. He looked at her across the table. You don't owe this family that. No, she agreed. But I'm here and I can see what needs doing, and I'd rather do it than not. He didn't answer that which was its own kind of answer, and they sat for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable, a silence that had in some way she couldn't have explained and didn't try to already become familiar. Then he said, The room's still cold. I've gotten used to it, she said. I'll get you another blanket. You already gave me 2. I'll find a 3rd, he said, and got up from the table, and that was the end of the conversation. The days settled into a rhythm after that, the way days do when there is enough work to give the hours shape. Abigail was up before anyone else every morning, and by the time the household stirred, she had already been to the cellar updated, her records checked the firewood supply against her consumption estimates, and begun something on the stove. She had developed by the end of the first week a system of management that accounted for every item in the house, its quantity, its rate of use, its potential for extension. And she adjusted her planning daily as conditions changed. She also began building the reserve. She did it quietly. Not secretly exactly, she was not a person who moved through the world by hiding things, but without announcement, because what she was doing was not yet finished, and finished things held their meaning better than half-finished explanations. She was setting aside small quantities from each day's supply, not enough to reduce what the family ate in any noticeable way, but enough accumulated over weeks to constitute something meaningful. Smoked rabbit from the 2 she'd managed to snare in the first week. Dried beans portioned into cloth sacks. Rendered fat from the cooking collected and sealed. Roots she'd preserved, using methods she'd learned a long time ago from a woman who'd lived through conditions that made this Wyoming winter look gentle. She stored it under the floorboards of her room in the space where the draft came in. Worst, which made it incidentally the coldest spot in the house, which was exactly what she needed. Emily found her at it one evening. Abigail heard the floorboard in the hallway, the one that creaked, the one she'd already memorized, and looked up to find Emily in the doorway of her room holding a lamp and looking at the loose floorboard and at the canvas-wrapped parcels visible in the space below it, with an expression that had moved past suspicion into something more complicated. "What is that?" Emily said. Abigail sat back on her heels and looked at Emily steadily. "An emergency reserve," she said. "Of our food." "Yes." "Why?" "Because the road has gone out 3 winters in 5, Abigail said. "And if it goes out this winter, what's in the cellar right now won't be enough. So I'm building a bridge." Emily looked at the parcels. She looked at Abigail. Something was working its way through her expression that was not simple to name. It was not anger. It was not relief. It was something more complicated than either the particular emotional texture of a person who has been holding a fear at the back of their mind for a long time and is now watching someone else demonstrate that the fear was real, had always been real, and is being taken seriously. "You knew," Emily said. "You knew from the beginning we weren't going to have enough." "I suspected," Abigail said. "The numbers told me clearly after the first morning." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't want anyone to be afraid," Abigail said. "And because knowing a problem and solving a problem are 2 different things, and I thought solving it quietly was more useful than announcing it loudly." Emily stood in the doorway for a long moment, with her lamp casting its light and her expression holding its complicated weather. Then she looked at the reserve and said, "Is it going to be enough? What you're building?" "I don't know yet," Abigail said honestly. "I'm trying to make it enough. Every day I add to it. If we have a normal winter, we won't need it. If we have a hard one..." "It'll be there," Emily said. "Yes." Another silence. Then Emily said in a voice that had lost most of its careful armor, "My mother used to do something like that. She kept a tin of flour hidden behind the linens. She said she never wanted us to have a day where there was nothing." "She sounds like a very practical woman," Abigail said. She was, Emily said. And the way she said it with that particular weight and completeness of the past tense that holds everything a person cannot say told Abigail more about Emily Walker than anything else in the 2 weeks she had been in that house. "I won't move it," Emily said, meaning the reserve. "I won't tell the boys." "Thank you," Abigail said. Emily nodded once with the gravity of someone entering into an agreement, and then she went back down the hallway with her lamp, and Abigail sat alone in her cold room for a long moment and felt something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The particular quality of rightness that comes when the thing you are doing and the thing that needs to be done are exactly the same. She lowered the floorboard and went back to work. It was Jacob who delivered the next shock, and he delivered it on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks after Abigail's arrival, with the flat matter-of-fact precision that 11-year-old boys deploy when they are reporting something they believe the adults should already know. He came into the kitchen where Abigail was preparing the noon meal and said without preamble, "The south fence is down." Abigail looked up. "How much of it?" "A whole section, past the creek bend. I saw it this morning when I went to check on the Hendersons' property like Pa asked." "Did you tell your father?" "He's out by the barn. He doesn't know yet." "Go tell him," Abigail said. "Right now. Don't wait." Jacob went. Abigail set down what she was doing and thought quickly through the implications. A downed fence in winter meant exposed livestock, which meant potential loss, which meant a cascade of problems downstream that she did not want to have to account for in her calculations when the margins were already this thin. She pulled on her coat. By the time she reached the barn, Caleb had already heard it from Jacob and was pulling on his work gloves with the expression of a man adding one more problem to a list that already had too many items on it. He looked up when she came in. "You don't need to come," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm coming anyway." He looked at her for a moment, gloves half on, and then looked away and said, "Bring the heavy wire from that hook, left side." They worked the fence for 2 hours in cold that meant business. Caleb doing the heavy structural repair while Abigail held sections and passed tools and did the smaller tasks with a competence that did not call attention to itself, but was simply present, continuous, reliable. The kind of help that doesn't require direction, because it comes from someone who is watching what's needed and providing it without being asked. Halfway through, Caleb said without looking up from the wire he was working, "You don't have to do everything you know." "I know," she said. "You're here to help with the house." "The fence is part of the house," she said. "Everything on this property is part of the house." He stopped working and looked at her, then that look, the one that moved past the surface. "Where were you before Philadelphia?" "Boston," she said. "Before that, a farm in Pennsylvania. Before that, a household in Baltimore." "And before Baltimore?" She worked the wire through the post without looking up. "My mother's house," she said, "which was also not quite enough, but was ours." He didn't push further. They finished the fence in the particular companionable silence of two people who have shared physical work and discovered in the sharing that they are both the kind of people who work without complaint and without performance, and that discovery has adjusted something in the way they occupy the same space. On the walk back to the house, their breath-making clouds in the cold air, Jacob falling into step beside them with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has decided someone is trustworthy. Caleb said quietly, "The Hendersons left." Abigail looked at him. "Left?" "Packed up. Drove south last week. They couldn't hold through another winter, I guess." He paused. "They're the third family this month." She absorbed this in silence. "That doesn't change anything for us," she said, and she said it with a certainty she had earned through 2 weeks of calculation and preparation, not a false certainty, not the kind that people manufacture to avoid fear, but the real kind, the kind that has been built from actual work and actual numbers. Caleb looked at her sideways. "How can you say that?" "Because I know what we have," she said. "I know what we're building, and I know what it takes to hold. 3 families left because they didn't have enough and didn't see a way through." She paused. "We have enough, and I can see a way through." He was quiet for a long moment. "I hope you're right," he said. "So do I," she said. Which was honest, which was the most useful thing she could offer him. Not false comfort, but the truth of a person who has done the work and is genuinely, if not absolutely confident in the outcome. That night, Abigail sat at the kitchen table after the house had gone quiet and opened her notebook to the reserve page and updated the numbers. Then she sat back and looked at what she had built over the past 2.5 weeks. Not just the reserve under the floor, but everything. The reorganized pantry, the foraging system, the firewood rationing schedule she'd quietly implemented, the small adjustments to the cooking that were stretching their supplies further than Caleb had believed possible. The children who were eating better than they had in months, who had stopped leaving food on their plates, not because there was more of it, but because what was there had been made to count for more. She looked at all of it. And then she added one more entry to her notebook, in the small, careful handwriting she'd developed across years of recording what was there against what was needed. It said, "Hold." Just that. One word. The entire plan distilled to its essential instruction. Hold. Because the winter had not yet shown them its worst face. And Abigail knew, with the particular knowledge of a woman who had survived enough winters to recognize the way they built. The way they gathered themselves in the first weeks, and then when they were ready, showed you what they had actually intended all along, that the worst was still ahead. But she also knew something else. Something she had not known when she knocked on the 12th door on that first afternoon with the snow coming and 11 rejections already behind her. She knew that this family was not going to fall. Not this winter. Not on her watch. Outside the window, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the distance across the frozen fields of Red Hollow, a third family's abandoned property stood empty in the dark, its doors unlatched, its windows dark, its cellar already half emptied and left behind. Abigail closed her notebook. She banked the fire. She went to bed in her cold room and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her, the particular sounds of a structure holding itself together against the cold, and she felt for the first time in longer than she could easily name that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The storm came without warning on a Thursday. Not the slow-building kind that gave a person time to prepare, time to pull in the livestock and bank the fire and bring in the last of the wood from the stack before the first real bite of it hit. This one dropped out of the north like something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment of inattention, and by the time Abigail registered the change in the air, that particular shift in pressure that she had learned to read the way a sailor reads water, it was already too late to do anything but react. She was at the woodpile when it hit. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took her to carry 2 armloads from the stack to the back door. And by the time she went back for the third load, the wind had come up so hard she had to lean into it to make forward progress. She made 4 more trips before Caleb appeared at the door and said with the tight jaw economy of a man who had seen this before and knew what it meant, "Get inside, leave the rest." "There's not enough in—" "I know," he said. "Get inside." She got inside. The blizzard settled over Red Hollow like it intended to stay forever. For the first 2 days, it was simply work, the continuous hard labor of a household keeping itself alive inside a storm of genuine severity. Caleb and Jacob fought their way to the barn morning and evening to tend the livestock. Abigail managed the fire, the food, and the temperature of the house with the focused precision of someone running calculations in real time, because she was. Every hour, she was running the numbers. Heat against fuel, food against bodies, supply against duration, and adjusting trimming. Compensating, always looking for the edge where enough became not enough so she could pull back from it before they reached it. Lucy developed a cough on the second day. It started as the kind of cough that children get in cold weather, the shallow, irritating bark that sounds alarming and usually means nothing. And Abigail watched it with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that could become serious, which meant she watched it without appearing to watch it because the last thing Lucy needed was to feel surveilled. By the third day, the cough had deepened. Abigail went to her notebook. She had recorded during her foraging trips in the weeks before the storm the location of several plants she had specifically collected for their medicinal value, not because she had been expecting illness, but because she had learned a long time ago that you collected what you might need before you needed it, because the moment you needed it was invariably the moment it became unavailable. She had dried pine needles and rose hips and the inner bark of birch, all of which she had been using in small quantities in the cooking for their nutritional value. She had also set aside in a separate wrapped parcel under the floorboards a small quantity of dried yarrow and wild ginger root that she had recognized along the fence line in her second week and gathered with the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. She said nothing to Caleb about the yarrow. Not yet. She made Lucy a tea from the rose hips and pine needles and sweetened it with the last of the honey, less than half a jar, which she had been rationing with the same discipline she applied to everything else. And she sat with the girl while she drank it in the particular manner of someone who is not hovering, but is simply present, which is a different thing, and children understand the difference. "It tastes strange," Lucy said. "Strange like bad, or strange like different?" Lucy considered this with the gravity that 8-year-olds bring to questions they take seriously. "Strange like something that's trying to help," she said. "That's exactly what it is," Abigail said. Lucy drank the rest of it. That night, Abigail lay in her cold room and listened to the storm, and listened beneath the storm for the sound of Lucy's breathing through the thin wall between their rooms, and she thought about the yarrow, and about what she knew and what she was watching for, and about the difference between a cough that was going to resolve and a cough that was the beginning of something else. The storm did not let up on the 4th day, or the 5th. On the 6th day, Caleb came in from the barn with his face set in a way she had not seen before, not the weary, resolute expression he usually carried, but something harder and more alarmed, the expression of a man who has absorbed a blow he was not fully prepared for. He sat down at the kitchen table, and she set coffee in front of him, the last of the real coffee which she had been saving for exactly the kind of moment that required something more than hot water, and waited. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "The freeze got into the cellar," he said. She went still. "The south corner," he said. "Where the wall's thinnest. The temperature dropped enough last night that it got through. I went down this morning to check." He paused. "We lost the preserved tomatoes. All of them. The potato stores on that side are compromised. Maybe half. He stopped. His hands tightened on the cup. "I did the count, Abigail. What's left down there? I did it the way you taught me, every item, every quantity." Another pause, longer this time. "We don't have enough." The words landed in the kitchen like something physical. She already knew it. She had known it was possible, had been running that scenario in her calculations for 3 weeks, had been building against exactly this eventuality with every parcel she'd added to the reserve under the floor. But knowing something was possible, and hearing it stated plainly by someone who had just confronted it for the first time, were different experiences, and she gave the statement a moment of honest wait before she responded. "How short are we?" she said. 6 weeks, maybe 7 if I—" He stopped again. "Abigail, it's February. We're 6 weeks short." She stood up from the table. "Come with me," she said. He followed her down the hall to her room. The cold room, the one he'd offered her, as barely better than the barn, the one she'd never complained about, and she knelt by the far corner and lifted the loose floorboard and stepped back so he could see. He crouched down. He looked at what was there, the careful rows of canvas-wrapped parcels, the cloth sacks tied at the neck, the sealed jars she'd managed to fill from the cooking surplus over weeks of patient accumulation, the smoked meat wrapped in cloth and stacked in the order she'd established, so she always knew exactly what was where and how much. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up at her, his expression held something she had no single word for. It was too many things at once, layered and complex, and visibly working through him in real time. "How long have you been building this?" he said. "Since the 4th morning," she said. "When I finished the first full inventory." "You knew." "I knew it was possible," she said. "I knew a hard winter would leave you short, and I knew the cellar had a vulnerability in the south wall. So I built against it." He stood up slowly like a man whose legs have gone uncertain under him, and turned to face her in the narrow room. "You've been saving this family," he said. "For months, without saying a word." "I was doing my job," she said. "This is not a job," he said. "This is not something a person does for a roof and a meal. This is—" He stopped, and she watched him look for the right word, and not quite find it, which was all right, because she did not need the word. She knew what it was. "Can we bridge the gap?" he said. "Yes," she said. "If we're careful. If we stretch what's in the cellar as far as it'll go, and we draw from this at the right moments, we can bridge the gap. We can make it to spring." He let out a breath. Then he sat down on the edge of her cot, the narrow cot in the cold room, and put his face in his hands for a moment, not dramatically, not with performance, but with the simple private motion of a man allowing himself one moment of the feeling he had been holding back for too long. She said nothing. She let him have the moment. When he lifted his head, his eyes were dry. But his voice when he spoke was not entirely steady. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "Fever. March of '84. I've been—" He stopped. "I thought I had it managed. I thought I knew what I was doing. And then the numbers—" He shook his head. "I almost lost them. I almost let my children starve to death because I was too proud or too scared or too—" "You didn't," Abigail said. "Only because you— Caleb." She said his name simply without softness or hardness, just his name spoken to interrupt the spiral. "Your children are upstairs. They are warm and they are fed and they are going to be all right. That is what matters. That is the only number that counts." He looked at her. "We start drawing from the reserve tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll tell you exactly how much and in what order. We keep the cellar as our visible supply so the children don't worry, and we use this to fill the gaps. By the time the road opens in spring, we'll have made it. And if the road doesn't open when we expect—" "I've accounted for that," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with that same complicated expression. "I don't know what I would have done," he said, "if you hadn't knocked on that door." "You would have found a way?" she said. "Maybe," he said. "But not this way." He paused. "Not as sure as this." He left her room and she stood alone in the cold for a moment, and then she knelt and replaced the floorboard and sat back on her heels and allowed herself briefly privately the particular emotion that she never let anyone see. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. Something that recognized the distance between where she had been on that porch 11 weeks ago and where she was now standing in the narrow cold room above a reserve she had built from nothing in a house that was going to survive because of decisions she had made in the dark while everyone slept. Then she stood up and went back to work. Lucy's cough worsened on the 7th day of the storm. Abigail heard it change in the night, the quality of it shifting from the shallow bark to something deeper and more effortful, the kind of cough that meant the chest was involved, that the body was working harder than it should be. She was out of her bed and in Lucy's room before she had fully formed the thought to move, and she put her hand on the girl's forehead and felt the heat there, and felt her own chest tighten with the particular fear that people who love children carry about fevers in winter, which is a different kind of fear from most others, because it is very old and very specific and has very good reasons for existing. Lucy opened her eyes. "Abigail," she said, and the fact that she said her name, not Pa, not Emily, but her name, as if Abigail was the person she expected to find in the dark, did something to Abigail's chest that she would not have been able to put into words. "I'm here," Abigail said. "You're all right." "My chest hurts." "I know. I'm going to fix that." She went to her room and retrieved the yarrow from the reserve she had been hoping not to need. It had been hoping the rosehip tea would be enough, and she came back and built the fever tea with the careful precision of someone who knows the difference between what helps and what hurts, and has very strong feelings about getting that distinction right. She sat with Lucy while she drank it, and then she sat with her after one hand on the girl's back, feeling the rhythm of her breathing, monitoring the fever by touch in the absence of any better instrument. Emily appeared in the doorway. At some point, Abigail didn't know what time it was. Late, very late, and looked at the scene with an expression that moved quickly through alarm into the controlled competence of a 14-year-old, who has learned that falling apart in a crisis doesn't help anyone. "How bad?" Emily said quietly, the way adults talk across sick children. "Manageable," Abigail said. The fever needs to come down. It will." "Are you sure?" "Yes," Abigail said. She wasn't entirely sure, but she was sure enough to say it, which was what Emily needed, and which was the truth in the way that mattered most. Not certainty about outcome, but certainty about effort, about attention, about the commitment to do everything that could be done, and to do it correctly. Emily sat down on the other side of the bed. Together, without discussion, without dividing up roles or making a plan, they sat with Lucy through the rest of the night, Abigail managing the fever and the tea and the careful monitoring of the girl's breathing. Emily present and steady and entirely committed, and Lucy moving in and out of sleep with the particular trusting helplessness of a sick child who knows she is being watched over and lets the knowledge hold her. Around 3 in the morning, the fever broke. Abigail felt it under her hand, the shift in the skin from that dry, terrible heat to the first light sweat that meant the body had won its argument, and she let out a breath she had been holding, she thought, for about 4 hours. Emily looked at her across the bed. "She's going to be fine," Abigail said. Emily nodded once, and then, with the same speed and privacy that her father had displayed in the cold room, she turned her face away for a moment and let herself feel what she had been holding back since she appeared in the doorway. Abigail looked at the ceiling and gave the girl her moment. Then Emily straightened up and said in a voice that was entirely under control, "You should sleep." "So should you," Abigail said. "I'll stay with her." "Emily, I'll stay with her," Emily said again, and this time the firmness in it was not the defensive firmness of a girl protecting territory, but something different. The simple, steady intention of a person who wants to be the one doing something useful for the person she loves, which is its own kind of healing, which Abigail understood and respected. "All right," Abigail said. "Come get me if anything changes." "It won't," Emily said, with the certainty of someone who has decided she will make sure of it, which is not the same as knowing, but is often just as effective. Abigail went back to her room and lay down on the cold cot and stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the storm begin, finally fractionally to loosen its grip on the night. And she thought about Lucy saying her name in the dark. And she thought about Emily's face turned away across the bed. And she thought about what it meant to be trusted with the vulnerable things of another family's life. And she thought that this specific weight of responsibility, this particular quality of being needed, not as a function, but as a person, was something she had not felt before, not in all the houses she had worked in, not in all the years of service she had rendered to households that used her labor and did not see her face. She had not known what she was missing. She was beginning to understand. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 9th day, it did so with a kind of sudden exhausted completeness that felt almost theatrical. One morning the world was white fury, and the next it was still and bright and brutally cold, but navigable, which after 9 days felt like abundance. Caleb was the first one out. He came back from the barn an hour later with his face carrying news, and Abigail read it before he spoke. 3 of the cattle, he said. The cold was too much for them. She absorbed this. 3 cattle was serious. It was not catastrophic. They still had the horses, still had the remaining livestock, still had enough of the herd to rebuild from, but it shifted the calculations in ways she needed to think through. The meat, she said immediately. He nodded. Already started. They worked together through that day, and into the next processing what could be salvaged from the lost animals, smoking, rendering, preserving, with the technique Abigail had developed over weeks of practice on smaller game. It was hard work and grim work in the specific way that practical necessity is sometimes grim, and they did it without speaking more than was required, with the focused efficiency of 2 people who understand the same thing and don't need to discuss it. Jacob worked alongside them without being asked. He didn't say much. He handed tools and held things and did what was needed, and at one point Abigail caught him looking at the work with an expression of determined concentration that was so much like his father's that she had to look away. That night, when the salvage work was done and the new supply had been incorporated into the reserve calculations, which changed the bridge, shortened. The necessary gap gave them more room than they'd had the day before. Abigail updated her notebook and sat back and looked at the revised numbers and felt something she could only call relief, solid and specific and earned. She was still looking at the numbers when Caleb came in. He looked at the notebook. "Better," he said. "Better," she said. "We lost the cattle, but we gained the winter supply from them. Net result is we're in better shape than we were before the storm." He sat down. He was exhausted in the bone-deep way that came from the kind of work they'd done that day, and he let himself sit with it in a way that he usually didn't. Usually, he held his weariness away from the table, managed it privately. Tonight, he simply sat, and the weariness sat with him. And Abigail noted the change without making anything of it. "The Hendersons' place," he said after a while. "Bowman stopped by this afternoon while you were inside. He says Henderson isn't coming back. He's selling the property." "To who?" "Don't know yet. Someone from back east, Bowman thinks. Some speculator who's been buying up failed properties." He paused. "It'll change things around here. If someone comes in and buys up enough land, starts controlling the water access." He stopped. Abigail looked at him. "Is that a real concern? It's happened in other territories," he said. "A man with enough money and a lawyer comes in, buys the land that borders the creek. Suddenly the ranchers who've been using that water for 20 years don't have legal access anymore." His voice was even, but she could hear beneath the evenness the specific unease of a man who has already survived too much to stomach losing what's left to something legal and distant and impossible to fight with physical strength. "Does your property have documented water rights?" she said. He paused. "I don't know," he said. "I never—" Another pause. "My wife handled the paperwork. When she died, He spread his hands slightly. "I kept the ranch running. I didn't look at papers." Abigail made a note in the margin of her notebook. "We need to find out," she said. "It may not come to anything," he said. "It may," she said. "And I'd rather know before we need to know than find out when there's no time to act." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was difficult to read, but held. She thought something adjacent to gratitude, not for any specific thing, but for the general fact of her presence, her attention, her consistent willingness to look at the hard thing directly. "I'll look for the papers," he said. "I'll help you," she said. He nodded. Then he said with a quality of casualness that she recognized as not casual at all, "How's Lucy?" "Better every hour. She ate a real meal at supper." "I know. I wanted to hear you say it." "She's going to be fine, Caleb," she said. "She's strong. Comes by it honestly." He looked at the table. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "She didn't," Abigail said. "That's what matters." Silence settled between them. The good kind. The kind that had become familiar over the weeks. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said enough and are comfortable in the rest. Then Ben's voice came from the hallway, the particular carrying tone of a 5-year-old who has woken from a nightmare and needs to locate the adults before he can decide whether the situation is manageable. "Pa." "Here, son," Caleb called, the sound of small feet. Ben appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, holding the corner of his collar in the way he did when he was not yet fully awake, and looked at them both with the slow reassembling expression of a child remembering that everything is in fact all right. "I heard the wind," he said. "Storm's over," Caleb said. Ben looked at Abigail. "Is Lucy better?" "She's sleeping," Abigail said. "She'll be right as rain by morning." Ben considered this. Then he crossed the kitchen and climbed without asking onto the bench beside Abigail, not beside his father, beside her, and leaned into her arm with the absolute trusting weight of a child who has decided where he feels safe and is acting accordingly. She went still. Not in discomfort. In something else entirely. She put her arm around him without thinking about it, without deciding to, with the same instinctive inevitability with which she had done everything else in this house, because it was needed, because she could provide it, because the distance between what was required and what she was willing to give had slowly, without announcement, collapsed to nothing. Caleb was looking at them. She didn't look at him. She looked at the lamp on the table and felt Ben's weight against her side and listened to the silence of the storm's absence, which was its own kind of sound. The sound of a house holding itself together, of a family intact on the other side of the worst thing they'd faced this winter. Then Ben said into the quiet, with the perfect guileless timing of a 5-year-old who has no idea what he is saying and also knows exactly what he is saying. "Abigail, are you going to stay with us forever?" The kitchen went entirely still. Caleb's expression did something complicated and private. Abigail kept looking at the lamp. "Let's get you back to bed," she said, and lifted him gently and carried him down the hall, and behind her, she heard Caleb exhale one long, slow breath, and she did not turn around. She tucked Ben in and sat with him for the 2 minutes it took him to fall back asleep, and then she stood in the doorway of his room in the dark and allowed herself to hold the question he had asked, not to answer it. Not yet, not with everything else still in motion, and the winter not yet finished, and the papers for the water rights still unfound, and the speculator from back east still an unknown quantity moving toward them from whatever direction speculators came from. Not yet. But she held it. She held it with the care you give something fragile and real and not yet ready to be put down. Then she went back to the kitchen, to the notebook, to the numbers, to the work that still needed doing. The winter she knew was not finished with them, but neither was she. The papers were in a tin box under the bed in the room Caleb had not entered since his wife died. Abigail didn't know that when she offered to help him look. She found out when he stood in the doorway of that room for a full 30 seconds without moving, not hesitating. The way a person hesitates when they've forgotten something, but the specific motionless quality of a person who is deciding whether they can do this. And she stood behind him in the hallway and said nothing and waited, because she had learned by then that Caleb Walker was not a man who needed to be pushed through anything, only given enough room to decide to move on his own. He moved. He crossed the room and knelt by the bed and pulled out the tin box and set it on the quilt and opened it. And Abigail came and sat across from him, and they went through the papers together. Deeds, receipts, correspondence documents. She didn't immediately recognize, and once she did. And she kept her attention on the papers, and not on his face, because his face was doing things that were private, and she respected that. She found the water rights documentation at the bottom. She read it carefully, then she read it again. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "You have a recorded water rights claim on the East Tributary," she said. "Filed in 1879. Your wife's name is on it." He reached across and took the document from her hand. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, and she watched something move through his expression, grief and relief, and something that looked very much like the ghost of his wife, making one final practical provision for the family she had left behind. "She filed it the year we were married," he said. "I didn't even know." She knew, Abigail said. He set the paper down carefully, the way you set down something you understand to be more valuable than it looks. "We need to get this to the land office," he said, "before whoever's buying the Henderson place gets there first." "Yes," she said, "as soon as the road's open enough to travel." The road opened 4 days later, barely grudgingly, in the way of Wyoming roads in February that have been asked to do more than they're ready for, and Caleb made the trip to town with the water rights document folded inside his coat against his chest, and Abigail stayed at the ranch with the children and the numbers and the reserve, which had now been drawn down to the precise calculated degree she had planned for. No more, no less, like watching a carefully built structure hold exactly the load it was designed to carry. He was back by mid-afternoon. She heard him on the porch and came to the kitchen doorway, and one look at his face told her the trip had been complicated. "The clerk at the land office said the recording is legitimate," he said, pulling off his coat. "The water rights are ours, clear and legal." "But," she said, because there was a but in his posture even if he hadn't spoken it yet, "but a man named Harlan Croft has already filed a purchase offer on the Henderson property. The clerk let that slip without meaning to, I think." He hung his coat and turned to face her. "I know that name. He bought 3 properties down in Carbon County last year. There were ranchers there who ended up they lost access to their grazing routes. Legal disputes that went on for months. By the time anything was settled, 2 of them had already left. Abigail absorbed this. "He uses the courts," she said. "He uses lawyers," Caleb said. "Which is worse because lawyers cost money and time, and most ranchers out here don't have either to spare." "Do you have the original deed to this property?" "In the box." "And the fence line documentation?" "What fence line documentation?" She looked at him. "The recorded survey of your property boundaries. When was the last time anyone walked your full fence line and confirmed it against the original survey description in your deed?" His expression told her the answer before he said it. "I need to look at your deed," she said. They spread it on this kitchen table that evening after the children were in bed, and Abigail read it with the careful, methodical attention she brought to everything, and what she found when she cross-referenced the legal description of the property boundaries against the fence line as she knew it from walking the property over the past 2 months made her go very still. "What?" Caleb said. "The south fence," she said. "The section that went down in the first storm, the one we repaired. What about it?" "According to the deed description, your southern boundary runs 12 feet further south than where your fence currently sits." He stared at her. That's Henderson's property line. Or it was. "No," she said. "According to this, it's your property line, which means the section of the creek that runs through what everyone has assumed was the Henderson property's northern edge." She looked up at him. "That's on your land, Caleb. That's your water, not just by the rights document your wife filed, but by the original survey description in your deed." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that happens when something large and invisible shifts beneath the floor of a situation, when the landscape of what a person thought was true rearranges itself without moving a single visible object. "If Croft buys the Henderson place," Caleb said slowly, "and he thinks that creek frontage is Henderson property, he'll file on it," Abigail said. "And then you'll be in a legal dispute over land that was yours all along, which will cost you time and money and emotional endurance that you cannot afford to spend. Unless we establish the boundary first." "Unless we establish it first," she agreed. "Officially. With the survey office, before he completes the purchase." Caleb looked at the deed. He looked at the water rights document sitting beside it. He looked at Abigail with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has been managing everything alone for too long, and is experiencing again and still the disorienting relief of not being alone anymore. "The survey office is in Rollins," he said. "That's 2 days' travel in this weather." "I know," she said. "I can't leave the ranch for 2 days. Not with—" "I know," she said again. "I'm not going anywhere. The ranch will be fine. The children will be fine. You need to go, Caleb." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're sure?" he said. "Not about the trip, about everything. About her." "I'm sure," she said. He left 2 mornings later with both documents in his coat and Jacob's solemn assurance that he would handle the morning barn work, which Jacob delivered with the 11-year-old's particular combination of pride and terror that Abigail found both endearing and entirely reliable. The first day without Caleb was fine. The second day brought Silas Croft to the door. She did not know at first who he was. He was a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory in the particular way of men who come from money and want you to know it without appearing to try a good coat, clean boots. Despite the road conditions, a manner of standing on porches that suggested he was accustomed to other people answering doors for him. He had a younger man with him who had the look of someone being paid to carry documents and look professional. "I'm looking for Caleb Walker," the man said when Abigail opened the door. "He's not here," she said. "And you are." She looked at him steadily. "Someone who lives here," she said. "Can I help you?" Something moved in his expression. The quick assessment, the adjustment, the slight recalibration that people made when they had expected one kind of obstacle and found another. "My name is Silas Croft," he said. "I represent a land acquisition interest in the Henderson property adjacent to this ranch. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Walker about some mutual concerns regarding shared boundaries." Mutual concerns. She had met this kind of language before. Language that sounded cooperative and was actually a survey of your defenses. Mr. Walker is away on business, she said. He'll return shortly. Perhaps I could leave some paperwork for his consideration. You're welcome to, she said. But I should tell you, Mr. Croft, that Mr. Walker is currently in Rawlins attending to his own property documentation. So any matters related to boundary lines or water access in this area are likely to be addressed there officially before he returns. The slight change in Croft's face was small enough that a person not watching for it would have missed it. She was watching for it. I see, he said. Is there anything else? She said. He looked at her for a moment. The full inventory, the deliberate assessment, with the specific quality of a man who is trying to determine how much a person knows and how much of what they know matters. Please tell Mr. Walker that I hope we can have a productive conversation, he said. Neighbor to neighbor. I'll pass that along, she said. Good day, Mr. Croft. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand flat on the door and her heartbeat doing something more interesting than usual, and her mind moving very quickly through the implications of what had just happened. He had come before the purchase was finalized, which meant he was trying to establish something presence claimed the appearance of existing relationship before the paperwork made his position harder to contest, which meant he knew or suspected that the property he was buying had complications, which meant someone at the land office had been less careful with information than they should have been. She went to the kitchen and sat down and wrote a letter to Caleb. She gave it to Jacob with instructions to find someone traveling toward Rawlins who could carry it. And Jacob, who had his mother's organizational instinct and his father's determination, was back within the hour, having located a farmer heading that direction, who would take it for the price of a jar of preserved goods, which Abigail paid without hesitation. Then she went to the shelf where she kept her notebook, and she opened it, and she turned to a fresh page, and she began writing something different from her usual columns and quantities. She began writing down everything she knew about the Walker property's boundaries, the water rights, the deed language, the survey description, and the precise nature of Silas Croft's visit, the date, the time, the words he had used, the name of the man with him, the nature of the documents he had offered to leave. She wrote it in the same careful small hand she used for everything, and when she was done, she read it back and thought about who else in Red Hollow might have information relevant to what was happening, and she made a list of those people. Then she put on her coat. She left Emily in charge. Emily, who accepted the responsibility with a gravity that suggested she had been waiting her whole life for someone to formally recognize what she had already been doing, and she went to town. She started at the general store where Mrs. Aldrich had been the repository of Red Hollow's collective knowledge for 30 years and knew it, and was generally willing to share it with people she had decided were worth sharing with. Abigail had been building that particular credit since her second week in town, when she had come in for supplies and treated Mrs. Aldrich like a person whose opinion mattered, which it did, and which apparently not everyone remembered to act like they knew. Silas Croft, Mrs. Aldrich said when Abigail said the name. Yes, he was in here 3 days ago, talking to anyone who'd listen about the Henderson place and what a fine investment opportunity the surrounding area represented. Did he talk to anyone about the Walker property specifically? Mrs. Aldrich looked at her over the counter with the particular expression of a woman who has been paying attention to everything for 30 years and is deciding how much of what she's paid attention to is relevant to share. He talked to Roy Pickett, she said. Roy Pickett was the man who had sold Caleb's fence posts the previous fall and kept careful records of every transaction he'd ever made and could tell you the property line of every ranch in the county from memory because he'd built fence on most of them. Does Roy Pickett talk freely? Abigail said. To the right people, Mrs. Aldrich said. He's particular about who he considers the right people. Where do I find him? She found Pickett at the feed store, a weathered man of 60, who looked at her with the unhurried assessment of someone who had been forming opinions about people for a very long time and was comfortable with the process. You're the woman at the Walker place, he said. Yes, sir. Heard about you, he said. Heard you kept that family fed through the worst of it. The family kept themselves, she said. I just helped with the numbers. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, What do you want to know? She told him about Croft's visit. She told him about the deed boundary discrepancy. She told him clearly and without drama what she believed Croft was attempting, and what the consequences would be if he succeeded, not just for the Walker property, but for anyone in the area whose land bordered what would become Croft's holdings. Pickett listened, without interrupting. He was the kind of man who listened the way he looked at things completely with full attention, not performing interest, but actually exercising it. When she finished, he said, "I built the fence on the Walker South line in 1876. I remember the survey stakes." "Do you remember where they were?" "I remember everything," he said. "And I remember that those stakes were 12 feet further south than where that fence ended up." Caleb moved it in 81 because the original line ran through a marshy section and the posts wouldn't hold. He meant to resurvey and refile, and then Margaret got sick, and then she died, and... He stopped. "Things get left undone." "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Abigail said. "In writing or to the survey office or wherever it becomes necessary." He looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you, Miss Turner?" he said, not unkindly. "I'm someone who doesn't want to watch another family lose their property because someone with money and a lawyer figured out the papers weren't in order," she said. Another long look. "Then, I'll talk to the survey office," he said. "And I'll put it in writing." "Thank you," she said. She made 2 more stops before she went back to the ranch. She spoke to the minister, who turned out to have been present at the original land filing and had a clear memory of it, and was quietly furious about Croft's activities in the county in a way that suggested he would be willing to make that fury productive. And she spoke to a woman named Dora Henshaw, whose husband had been one of the Carbon County ranchers who had lost a grazing dispute to Croft's operations 2 years earlier, and who told Abigail things about Croft's methods with a specificity and detail that suggested she had been waiting for a long time for someone to ask. By the time Abigail walked back into the Walker kitchen in the late afternoon, she had a clearer picture of Silas Croft than he would have been comfortable with, and she had 3 people prepared to take action on behalf of a family that hadn't known they needed defending. Emily looked up from the stove when she came in. "Well," Emily said. "We're going to be all right," Abigail said. Emily studied her face the way she had learned to study it over the past months, reading the precise quality of the words, distinguishing between the kind of statement that was reassurance and the kind that was assessment. "You mean it," Emily said. "I mean it," Abigail said. Caleb came back the following evening. He came through the door with the expression of a man who has accomplished something and is not yet sure what it has cost him, and he found Abigail at the kitchen table with her notebook open and her documentation of Croft's visit, and her list of the people she had spoken to, and what each of them had offered, organized in the precise clean columns that she brought to everything. He sat down and read it. He read it all the way through without speaking, and she sat across from him and let him read. And when he looked up, his expression was the complicated one she had come to know, the one that was too many things at once to name any single one of them. "You did all this," he said, "in 2 days." "Roy Pickett did the most important part," she said. "He remembers the original survey stakes. His testimony will establish the boundary without dispute." Abigail, "The minister will corroborate the original filing, and Dora Henshaw has documents from the Carbon County dispute that show Croft's standard method of operation. If he tries the same thing here, there'll be a paper trail that contradicts every move before he makes it." "Abigail," he said again, with a quality in the repetition that was different from the first time, not clarifying, not astonished, something more private and more careful than either of those. She stopped talking. He looked at her across the table, with the specific directness of a man who has decided to say a thing he has been not saying for a considerable period of time, which requires she had learned a particular quality of stillness from the person being looked at. She went still. "I went to Rollins," he said, "to file the water rights and the boundary documentation, and while I was there—" He paused, not hesitating, choosing. "While I was there, I found myself thinking that I was doing it for the ranch, for the children, for the property." He stopped again. "And then I realized that wasn't entirely true." She said nothing. "I was doing it because you told me to," he said, "because you found the problem and explained it clearly, and told me what needed to be done, and I trust your judgment more than I trust my own about most things." and I've been trusting it since the first week you were here, and I don't think I've said that plainly." "You didn't need to," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "I want to say things plainly because I've gotten into the habit of not saying them, and I don't think it's served me well." Outside, the wind was doing something mild and almost civil for February, which in Wyoming qualified as a sign of spring's distant intentions. "You saved my family," he said. "Not in a general way. Specifically, the reserve, Lucy's fever, the papers, Croft at the door." He paused. "And every meal and every calculation, and every night you sat up doing the numbers, so I didn't have to be afraid of the numbers anymore." "You were never afraid of the numbers," she said. "You just didn't want to look at them." "Same thing," he said. And the directness of that acknowledgement, the willingness to own it without defense, was so characteristic of him that she felt it like a familiar thing. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "The job Mrs. Patterson offered you." She went still in a different way. He knew about that. He had not mentioned knowing about it, and she had not mentioned the offer. Mrs. Patterson had come to the ranch 3 days after the worst of the blizzard broke, when word had spread through town the way word always spread through a place like Red Hollow, selectively and thoroughly, about what had happened at the Walker property during the worst winter in a decade. She ran the general store with her sister, now that her husband was gone. She had steady income, a private room above the store, and a supply chain that made food security a different kind of problem from the one Abigail had been managing here. She had offered Abigail a salary, a real one in dollars, not in roof and meals, and had been gracious about it in a way that suggested she understood both the value of what she was offering and the weight of what she was asking Abigail to consider. "How do you know about that?" Abigail said. "Mrs. Patterson told Bowman," he said. "Bowman told the minister. The minister—" He stopped. "Red Hollow is a small town." "Yes," she said. "It is. Are you going to take it?" The question sat between them on the table, simpler and more complicated than any of the documents or calculations or survival plans she had spread out in this kitchen over the past months. She looked at her notebook. She thought about the tin of beans she'd carried from Philadelphia. She thought about 11 doors. She thought about Ben's weight against her side, and Lucy saying her name in the dark, and Emily turning her face away across the sickbed so no one would see what she felt, and Jacob handing her the fence wire without being asked. She thought about Caleb Walker standing in the doorway of this kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, with snow clouds gathering, and something in his tired eyes that had chosen against the logic of scarcity and difficulty, and too much to manage alone to say yes. "I haven't decided," she said. Which was true, and which was not the whole truth, and which both of them understood. He nodded slowly. "I'm not asking you to stay because we need the help," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I could hire someone else for the house. I could find someone to help with the children." He paused. "I'm asking something different." She looked at him. "I'm asking you to stay because you belong here," he said. "Not because we need a roof fixed or the cellar managed or someone to count the beans. Because this house is different with you in it. Because those children are—" His voice caught very slightly and then recovered. "Because I see you, Abigail. Not what you can do. You." The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about being seen. She thought about how rarely it had happened and how precisely she had always known the difference between being used and being known, and how the distance between those two things had been for most of her life the full length of her loneliness. "I'm not easy to have around," she said, and it was not false modesty. It was honesty. The honesty of someone presenting information the other person deserved to have. "I've noticed," he said. "You're in the cellar before I wake up. You correct my arithmetic. You argued with me for 20 minutes about the firewood rationing. I was right about the firewood rationing." "You were absolutely right about the firewood rationing," he said. "That's not a complaint." Something loosened in her chest. Something she had been holding at a particular careful tension for a long time. A tightness she had become so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it was there until just now when it eased. "I need to think," she said. "Take your time," he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, that this was not a negotiating position or a form of pressure, just the genuine statement of a man who understood that a real answer was worth more than a quick one, and was willing to wait for the real one. He stood up from the table. "The reserve," he said. "Whatever you decide, what you built under that floor." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand what that was. That wasn't work. That was—" He stopped, and she thought he was going to leave the sentence incomplete, but then he finished it quietly. "That was love. The way it actually looks, not the way people talk about it." He went to bed. Abigail sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time after that. She sat with the notebook and the lamp, and the particular silence of a house full of sleeping people she had spent 4 months keeping alive. And she sat with what he had said, and she sat with who she had been before the 12th door, and who she appeared to be now on the other side of it, and she sat with the question of what a woman owed herself when she had spent her whole life being told she could only ask for the smallest portion of everything. The lamp burned low. She didn't move to trim it. She let it burn. She made her decision at 4 in the morning. Not dramatically, not with tears or revelation, or the kind of moment that announces itself as significant while it's happening. She made it the way she made every other important decision in her life, quietly, with her hands flat on the table, and her notebook open in front of her, and the numbers laid out plainly where she could see them. Only this time, the numbers were not quantities of grain, or firewood, or preserved meat. This time, the numbers were 4 months. 12 weeks of reserve built under a floorboard. 11 doors before the 12th opened. One family on the other side of the worst winter Red Hollow had seen in a decade whole and fed and alive, and one woman who had arrived with a tin of beans and a broken boot and the accumulated weight of every place that had looked at her and decided she was not worth the trouble. She sat with all of it. Then she closed the notebook, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. When she woke, she knew what she was going to do. Not because the morning had brought clarity that the night lacked, but because the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thinking, and she had simply been waiting for her conscious mind to catch up to what the rest of her already understood. She was going to town. She dressed in the cold, and she went downstairs, and she left a note on the kitchen table that said only, "Back by noon. Keep the fire." And she walked the 3 miles into Red Hollow in the thin, bright cold of a Wyoming morning that was for the first time since November doing something that resembled trying. Mrs. Patterson was already in the store when Abigail arrived. She was a practical woman with a kind face and the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had been managing difficult situations for long enough that they no longer needed to perform composure, they simply had it. She looked up when Abigail came in. She read Abigail's face the way perceptive women read faces, which is completely and immediately, and she set down what she was doing and came around the counter. "I came to thank you," Abigail said, "for the offer. It was generous and it was real, and I want you to know I understood both of those things." "But you're not taking it," Mrs. Patterson said. "No, ma'am, I'm not." Mrs. Patterson looked at her for a moment. Then she said with the particular warmth of a woman who has watched enough of life to know what certain kinds of decisions cost and what they're worth, "Does he know yet?" "Not yet," Abigail said. "He's a good man," Mrs. Patterson said. "Stubborn and not easy, but good, the way good actually is, not the way people use the word when they mean agreeable." "I know," Abigail said. "That's why." Mrs. Patterson nodded once with the finality of a woman closing a chapter she is satisfied with, and went back to her work, and Abigail walked back out into the morning. She was halfway down the main street of Red Hollow, moving with the particular purposeful stride of someone who knows exactly where they're going when she heard his voice. "Well, look at that!" She stopped. She knew the voice before she turned. She knew it the way you know the sound of something that hurt you, not from any particular quality in the tone, but from the specific sensation it produced in the body, that tightening along the shoulders, that involuntary arrangement of the face into the careful neutral expression she had trained herself to wear in the presence of people who were looking for a reaction. It was Gerald Marsh. He was the man who had laughed, not the man at the 4th ranch who had said he had enough problems without adding to them, That man she had almost forgiven, because his cruelty had at least been direct. Gerald Marsh was the hired hand standing beside him, who had laughed when he said it. The particular easy laugh of a man who has found a safe target, and is enjoying the safety of it, and who had called after her as she walked back to the road, something she had not responded to and had not forgotten. He was standing outside the barber shop with another man she didn't know, and he was looking at her with an expression that had not changed substantially from the one she remembered, that comfortable contempt, that casual willingness to diminish. "Heard you found yourself a situation out at the Walker place," he said. "Doing the cooking and cleaning. Guess that's about right for someone like you." The man beside him glanced between them with the uncertain expression of someone who has stumbled into a dynamic he doesn't fully understand. Abigail looked at Gerald Marsh. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She looked at him with the full, steady attention of a woman who has spent 4 months keeping 4 children alive through the worst winter in a decade, who has stood between a family and starvation, and one who has read deeds and water rights documentation and organized a defense against a land speculator and sat up through the night with a fevered child and built a reserve from nothing, and been told by a man she respects that what she built looked like love. She looked at him with all of that behind her eyes, and she felt nothing. Not anger. Not the old familiar contraction of shame. Not the careful performance of indifference that she had maintained for years because the real indifference wasn't available. Just nothing. Just the specific clean emptiness of a person looking at something that has lost all power to hurt them and is only just now realizing it. "Good morning, Mr. Marsh," she said, and she walked on. She didn't hurry. She didn't slow. She walked at exactly the pace she had been walking before he spoke, and she did not look back. And the extraordinary thing, the thing she noticed as she walked with a quality of quiet wonder, was that she was not managing herself. She was not holding the hurt behind the neutral expression or pressing the humiliation down into the place where she stored things she couldn't afford to feel in public. There was nothing to hold. There was nothing to press down. She was simply walking. She was simply free. She was back at the ranch before noon as the note had promised. Caleb was in the yard when she came through the gate. He had been splitting wood, the ordinary physical work of a man who splits wood when he needs something to do with what he's feeling, and he stopped when he saw her and set the axe down and waited, because he was, as Mrs. Patterson had said, not easy, but good, in the way good actually was. She walked up to him and stopped at a conversational distance and looked at him directly. "I went to see Mrs. Patterson," she said. His expression moved very carefully. "And I declined the offer," she said. The careful expression held for one more second. Then something in it shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the performance that less honest people might have brought to the moment, just a simple alteration, like a room when someone opens a window. "Abigail, I'm not staying because I need a roof," she said, because she needed to say it clearly, needed him to know the difference was not a small one. "And I'm not staying because those children need someone, though they do, and I love them, and I want to be honest about that too." She paused. "I'm staying because you were right about what you said last night, and I'm not willing to walk away from something real, because I've spent my whole life being told I only deserve what I can negotiate out of the smallest possible situation." He was very still. "You said stay because I belong here," she said, "and I think you're right. I think I do. And it's the first time in my life I've been anywhere and believed that, and I'm not. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter because I'm afraid of wanting something that could be taken away." "It won't be taken away," he said. "You can't promise that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can tell you that I've buried a wife and raised 4 children alone through 3 bad winters, and held this property together on the edge of everything it had, and I know the difference between a thing that's built to last and a thing that isn't." He looked at her steadily. "This is built to last." She heard him. She really heard him, not the words over the surface of her old defenses, but the words landing in the actual place they were aimed, which was the part of her that had been waiting across more years and more closed doors than she could count for someone to say something true about her and mean it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said again, and the simplicity of it was not inadequacy, it was completion. The way the right answer to a long calculation is often the shortest thing on the page. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he reached out and took her hand, the rough, work-worn hand of a man who had been splitting wood and managing livestock and holding a family together with insufficient resources for 3 years, and held it with the careful, deliberate grip of someone who understands the weight of what they're holding. "I'll need to speak to the children," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should do it together." He nodded. He didn't let go of her hand, and she didn't move to take it back, and they stood in the yard, in the February brightness, that was doing its level best to become something like spring. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, because neither of them needed to. Then, "Ben's going to be insufferable about this," he said. "Ben predicted it from the second week," she said. "He asked if I was going to stay forever." "He told me," Caleb said. He also told Jacob it was already settled, and Jacob told him he was being ridiculous. A pause. "Jacob came to me last week and said he hoped I wasn't going to be stupid about it." She looked at him. "He said that—" "He's 11, Caleb said. "They say exactly what they mean. It's one of the more useful things about them." She laughed. It came out unexpected, the real kind. The kind that starts in the chest and doesn't ask permission. And Caleb Walker looked at her laughing in the yard, with the particular expression of a man encountering something he has been wanting to see for a long time and is now allowing himself to simply look at. They told the children at dinner. Caleb did it simply in the plain, direct way he handled everything he considered important. Told them that he had asked Abigail to stay not as a hired hand, but as part of the family, and that she had said yes, and that he wanted to know what they thought. Ben said, "I knew it," with the triumphant certainty of a 5-year-old who has been waiting for the adults to catch up to the obvious. Jacob looked at Abigail across the table with the serious, evaluating expression she had come to love in him and said, "Are you going to keep doing the inventory?" "Every morning," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his dinner, which was from Jacob a speech. Lucy set down her fork and looked at Abigail with those large, perceptive eyes that had seen everything from the beginning and said, "You stayed when I was sick." "Yes," Abigail said. "I knew you would," Lucy said, "even before you knew." Abigail looked at this 8-year-old child who had her mother's eyes and her father's bedrock quality, and some additional thing that was entirely her own, and felt the particular emotion that does not have a convenient name. The one that lives at the intersection of gratitude and grief and joy, and the overwhelming recognition of being precisely where you are supposed to be. "You were right," Abigail said. "You usually are." Emily said nothing through all of this. She sat at her end of the table with her food and her composed expression and her arms not folded, which was notable because Emily's arms were frequently folded, and she waited until the younger children had finished and been sent to get ready for bed. And then she waited until her father had gone out to do the evening barn check. And then she sat alone at the table with Abigail in the particular quality of silence they had developed between them over 4 months of working side by side in the kitchen, the silence that meant something was coming. "I want to say something," Emily said. "All right," Abigail said. Emily looked at the table. She was choosing her words with care, the way she did everything, not slowly but precisely, with the intention of saying exactly what she meant, and not something adjacent to it. "When my mother died," she said, "I decided I wasn't going to trust anyone who came into this house. Because everyone who came and went before you, the women we hired for a few weeks here and there, the neighbors who helped out, they always left. They left because we were too much. Too many children, too much work. Not enough money, too much of everything that made it hard." She paused. "I decided you were going to leave too. I was waiting for it. Every good thing you did, I was waiting for it to be the last thing before you walked out." Abigail said nothing. She let Emily finish. "And then the storm," Emily said, "and the reserve, and Lucy." She stopped for a moment, and something worked through her expression that was not quite controlled, but was working toward it. "And I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I stopped waiting somewhere in the middle of it, and I didn't notice until just now." She looked up. "I don't have a word for what you are. You're not my mother. You're not. I don't want you to try to be her. I don't need that." "I know," Abigail said. "But you're not nothing," Emily said. "You're not just someone who works here. You're—" She stopped. "I don't know the word." "You don't need one right now," Abigail said. Emily nodded once. Then, in the brisk, efficient manner of a 14-year-old who has said the important thing and is now ready to be done. Feeling vulnerable, she stood and collected the dinner plates and began stacking them with the organized purpose that was so deeply characteristic of her that it was almost its own language. Abigail stood and picked up the serving dish. They washed the dishes together without speaking, shoulder to shoulder at the wash basin, in the familiar, comfortable rhythm of two people who have done this particular task together many times and know each other's movements well enough to share the space without collision. When they were done, Emily dried her hands and said without looking at her, "Welcome to the family, Abigail." Then she went upstairs. Abigail stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, with her hands still damp from the wash basin and the lamp burning warm on the table, and the sound of the house settling into its nighttime self around her. And she thought about the word Emily had reached for and not found. And she thought that maybe the absence of an existing word for it was not a deficiency, but an accuracy. That what she was to this family and what they were to her was in fact something that had not needed a name before, because it had not existed before, had not been built before, had not been constructed out of a winter's worth of early mornings and careful numbers and smoked rabbit and fever teas and fence wire and documents, and a reserve built in the dark while everyone slept. Some things, she thought, have to be made before they can be named. The spring came in the way Wyoming springs always come, argumentatively, in fits and starts, one warm day followed by a cold snap, the road opening and then threatening to close again, the world negotiating with itself about whether it was ready to let winter go. But it came. It always came. That was the thing Abigail had known about springs even in the darkest part of January, when the numbers were thin and Lucy's fever was high and the storm showed no sign of ending, that springs were not conditional. They came regardless. You just had to be present when they arrived. Silas Croft's purchase of the Henderson property was completed in March. He arrived in Red Hollow with his lawyer and his document case and his manner of a man who expects the landscape to arrange itself according to his plans, and he found instead a boundary survey on file with the Territorial Office that had been submitted by Roy Pickett, witnessed by the minister, and corroborated by documentation from Dora Henshaw regarding previous disputes. All of it assembled and organized in the precise, careful fashion of someone who understood that the difference between a claim that holds and a claim that doesn't is almost always a question of paperwork. His lawyer reviewed the filing. His lawyer advised him that contesting the Walker boundary would be expensive, uncertain, and inadvisable, given the quality of the documentation on record. Croft came to the ranch. Abigail answered the door. He stood on the porch in his good coat and his clean boots and looked at her with the expression of a man who is in the process of revising his assumptions about a situation he thought he understood. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Walker," he said. "Of course," she said. "I'll let him know you're here. In the meantime, the boundary survey has been filed and recorded. The water rights are registered. The fence line will be restaked in the spring according to the original survey description." She paused. "Is there anything else you'd like me to pass along?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You did that," he said. "Not a question. The filing, the witnesses, all of it. The community did it," she said. "I just asked the right people the right questions." He studied her with the expression of a man encountering something he did not anticipate and is deciding what category to assign it to. "You're not what I expected to find at this ranch," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I rarely am." He left without speaking to Caleb. He did not come back. The proposal happened on a Tuesday in April, which was not the most romantically appointed day of the week, but was the day Caleb Walker walked into the kitchen where Abigail was updating her spring planting records and said without preamble in the plain direct way he handled everything he considered important, "I want to marry you." She looked up from the notebook. I know it's not a question the way it should probably be asked," he said. "I was going to ask it properly. I practiced." He paused. "I forgot the practice when I came in and saw you at the table with the notebook. And I thought there's no version of this conversation where the answer isn't going to be whatever it's going to be." And the practice seemed beside the point. She looked at him. "Will you marry me, Abigail Turner?" he said. "Not because we need help with the house. Not because the children are fond of you, though they are. And Ben has already told Jacob it's settled, so Jacob is insufferable about having been wrong. Not because you're good at the numbers, or because you saved this family, or because you know where the reserve is stored and how much is left." He stopped. "Because you're you. Because I see you. Because I would like for whatever time I've got to see you every day." She closed the notebook. "Yes," she said. He exhaled that same long, slow breath she had heard from the hallway on the night Ben asked his question. And the expression on his face was not triumph or relief, but something quieter and more settled, like a man arriving somewhere he had been trying to get to for a long time, and finding it exactly as he had hoped. They were married in May in a ceremony that was simple and attended by the people who mattered, which turned out to be more people than either of them had anticipated. Roy Pickett came. Mrs. Patterson came and brought her sister. The minister performed the ceremony with the particular warmth of a man who feels he had a hand in the outcome and is not wrong about that. Dora Henshaw came and sat in the second row and cried in the practical way of a woman who cries at weddings because they are worth crying at and has no patience for apologizing for it. Ben stood beside his father and took the role of ring-bearer with a gravity that lasted approximately 4 minutes before he began asking in a stage whisper whether they were almost done, because he was hungry, which broke the solemnity of the moment entirely and made Caleb's shoulders shake with the suppressed laughter of a man who loves his son without qualification. Lucy held Abigail's hand through the entire ceremony. She held it with both of hers, the small, tight grip of a child who is making sure of something. Emily stood straight and composed and dry-eyed throughout, because she was Emily, and when Abigail turned to face the small gathered group as Abigail Walker. For the first time, Emily met her eyes across the room with an expression that said everything the 14-year-old had already said at the kitchen sink. And a few things she hadn't needed words for then and didn't need them for now. Jacob shook Abigail's hand afterward with the formal solemnity of a boy who has decided to treat the occasion with the dignity he felt it deserved, and said, "I was wrong about you staying," with the directness of a person who considers an honest admission of error to be a form of respect. "You were cautious," Abigail said. "That's not the same thing as wrong." He considered this and appeared to find it a satisfactory reframe. There was a celebration after at the ranch where the food was abundant in a way that Red Hollow had not seen from the Walker table in several years, and where several of the neighbors who had watched the worst winter in memory from behind their own closed doors and their own thin supplies found themselves eating better than the season warranted, and understanding that this was the direct result of a woman who had arrived with a tin of beans and a notebook, and had quietly, without fanfare or announcement, made everything more than it had been. Late in the evening, when the guests had gone and the children had been put to bed, Ben only after 2 additional requests and 1 firm instruction from his father. Abigail stood in the kitchen that was hers now, in every sense, and looked at the shelf where her notebook sat, worn at the corners, watermarked at the edges, full from cover to cover, with the small, careful columns of a woman who had spent her life counting what was there against what was needed. She took it down. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table, opened it to the last page, and in the final small column at the bottom of the last sheet, she wrote 1 entry. Not a quantity, not a calculation, not an estimate of supply against duration. She wrote, "Arrived, stayed, enough." She closed the notebook. She set it back on the shelf, and Abigail Walker, who had once believed she deserved only the smallest portion of everything, a roof, 1 meal, a corner to sleep in, stood in the kitchen of her home in the life she had built from a floorboard reserve, and a child's fever tea, and a tin of beans, and the stubborn, unextinguishable belief that her own worth was not contingent on anyone else's willingness to recognize it. And she knew not, hoped not, wished, not tried to convince herself, but knew with the same certainty she brought to every number she had ever recorded that she had always deserved this. She had simply needed to find the door that would open, and when it did, she had walked through it with everything she had. That was enough. That had always been enough.